Good morning. So this week's class is the topic, the positive, constructive state of mind that we're working on cultivating is contentment. Last week it was patience. And as we've said before, on the event page at the very bottom, you'll find a link where it says course materials, and every week we'll update the course materials with an integration practice that you'll be able to use from the previous material for 2 weeks up until the new material. And so that's true of all of the previous classes. And as of this morning, it's true for the contentment class. So over the next 2 weeks, you can integrate what we talk about today, and then we'll move on next week. And so if anyone did work with what was there for patients and they had anything that they wanted to talk about, or of course it's not necessary, but just to give space if anyone did want to talk about anything that came up with them when they were working with the patient's material. If they did, we can start with that. Last class, uh, uh, experiencing this idea, if a person has experiencing a difficult, there was this idea for a certain amount of, I was saying, well, from the Buddhist perspective, the mind is a continuity and is a beginningless and endless continuity, or, if you don't go that far, at least with lifetime, the mind, a single continuity, and there's no single mental event that doesn't have preceding causes and conditions, right? So because this happened, then necessarily that's like that, the instigating event is the first moment that, and but we might frame it that way, like, oh, the person yelling at me, that's the first moment of this episode of where I might get angry, or I might not get angry. And we think, well, after that happens, after I've been yelled at, then what do I do? What do I, this person's angry, this person's, or they were rude, or they were dismissive, or whatever kind of triggered me. And then after that has happened, how do I, as you said, how do I respond? But the mind is a continuity, right? The being yelled at, the being disrespected, that isn't the first moment. That is just a thing that happened in the context of the continuity of the mind. And so everything that happened in the mind prior to that is going to determine, to a large extent, what options we have to be able to react, or to be able, what's the mental stage, what's the stage of the mind like at the time when whatever event is happening. So that, what that means is that we can prepare, like you said, we don't have to only think about, okay, well, when I get yelled at, I will try to bring this to mind, or I will try to do, we can do those things right now, we're not being, when these things aren't happening, when no one's being disrespectful, when, in meditation, in reflection, in contemplation, in journaling, and that's really what meditation is. It's a sort of a safer place to practice, to work on the laboratory of the mind, so that in daily life, in real life, when the rubber hits the road in our experiences, we've got this training, we've got all of this prior experience, this prior practice that is going to make it possible for the mind to remain open and spacious, and not just have to think about it in terms of, when this happens, what am I going to do about what happens, but how, you know, and it's like any skill. It's like, Venerable Urbina talks about driving, right? And how when we're 16, 17, wherever, we're learning to drive, there are, the hope is that nothing goes terribly wrong for a while, so that we can develop skills, right? Certainly it's possible. We know that younger drivers have more accidents than older drivers. People who've been driving for 10, 20 years have fewer, generally, statistically, fewer accidents than people driving in the first 5 years of their driving careers, because they haven't really developed all of the necessary skills for, if there's no ice, if there's no, hail, if there's no sudden thunderstorms, if there's no really, drunk drivers or, distracted drivers, then you don't have to know how to handle that. You can just sort of, slowly gain, and we kind of have to hope that we can do that. You start driving in parking lots, you start driving on, you know, um, roads, subdivision roads, and so before you go onto the highway, before you challenge yourself to go out into the snow and so on. But certainly it's possible that people are going to meet with conditions that they can't handle, at a younger age. And that's when, terrible things can happen. And the same thing is true, like what the question that came last week about sort of PTSD, and this idea that a person, and of course, that's not to say that there's something wrong with a person who develops a trauma response to some terrible thing. But what I was saying before is that if, just like with driving, if we actually, because of course these terrible things can't just like a drunk driver or whatever, they can happen to a person before they've had the ability to gain the knowledge, the skills, the ability to handle that situation. Um, but given time, given the right circumstances, we ourselves can get to a place where all of that preparatory work actually prevents all of these negative consequences when really challenging things happen, because we are, the mind is already able, just like with driving, when the black ice is there on the road, if you've got 10 years of driving experience, you're going to be able to navigate that. You're going to be able to bring your car safely to a stop and not spin out of the traffic, not. But if you've only been driving for a week and then there's this, really freak thing, could go really, really wrong. And the mind is the same. The mind is, we're able to hopefully in meditation, in a safe kind of training environment, be able to develop these skills prior to having to deal with really intense things. So we work with minor things. We work with, like with patients, we work with inconvenience. We work with, smaller things. And then when, the cancer diagnosis, when with the loss of the loved one, when, or the loss of a job, these, the divorce, these sort of major life events that are really more challenging, when they happen, they don't spin us out completely. We don't go down really dark roads. We're able to have already in the mind all of the same skills, coping mechanisms, ability to reframe things, the awareness and transformation that we talked about. So that's really the Buddhist approach, is that we can create the mental environment to not actually have to experience the worst kinds of results from life's challenges, if we spend that time, that energy, that effort ahead of time. Okay, so contentment is today's topic. So this is definitely a topic that is part of the Buddhist, presentation, the Buddhist world view. It's a little bit different, actual single topic. It's a little bit different than, say, patience, right? Because patience, there's specific ways of training in patience directly, from the Buddhist perspective. There's, patience is actually a very big topic in Buddhism. And we didn't go into all of the Buddhist approaches to patience, but you can study those. There's, armor-like patience and but it's a very big topic in Buddhism. Whereas contentment is also talked about in Buddhism, and it has a definition, and it has a way of training, but it's not specific in the same way that patience is different than loving kindness, for example. When you're training in patience and you're training in loving kindness, or you're training in generosity, those are unique kind of ways that are like, the training in patience is different than the training in generosity, which is different than the training in compassion and loving kindness and so on. Contentment, from the Buddhist perspective, is really more like a side effect of all of Buddhist training. It is and so we'll go into a little bit the distinction, or with all of these, there's sort of a conventional or colloquial way of talking, and then there's a more Buddhist way of talking. So because this class is sort of a combination of these two ideas, we'll look at these two different ways of thinking about it. From the Buddhist perspective, contentment is the result of having trained the mind in all of the different Buddhist ways of training the mind. It is the subjective experience of someone who is following the general Buddhist trainings, wherein there is a reduction in all of the afflictive states of mind. There's a reduction in hatred, there's a reduction in jealousy, there's a reduction in, attachment, where we're trying to, just bring pleasant things into our experience. There's a reduction in aversion, where we feel that our happiness is, we've talked about attachment and aversion, before. Attachment is a mind that observes that which seems pleasant, exaggerates the pleasant aspect, and feels that one's happiness is dependent upon possessing that which seems pleasant. Aversion is the opposite, where the mind apprehends something that seems unpleasant and feels that one's happiness is threatened, and only oneself can be happy when one is separated from what seems unpleasant. So all of these afflictive states together are just another way of talking about afflictive states, is disturbing attitudes or disturbing states of mind. They agitate the mind. So contentment and agitation, of course, are conflicting. You can't be content and agitated at the same time. So whatever degree to which we remain under the influence, as an ordinary sentient being, as one does, remain under the influence of hatred and attachment and aversion and jealousy and maliciousness, and then the mind is agitated to the extent that those are arising in our experience. And then contentment is therefore blocked to the extent that those are present in the mind. So it's a little bit different. In that sense, it's deeper than the colloquial way, which is, I think often true, because the colloquial way is based on sort of Western understandings of the nature of the mind and the capacity of the mind. And there's no understanding of how powerful the mind is from the Western perspective. Even just the idea of fully qualified calm abiding doesn't exist in the Western way of thinking about the mind. Which would be a very contented state, but it would be temporary. Geshe-la was talking, when he was talking, teaching about calm abiding, he was saying calm abiding, which is a very, very deep state of meditative concentration, only temporarily suppresses the afflictions. It doesn't by itself. He was talking about joining calm abiding with wisdom realizing nature of reality. And that combination is really the effective combination, whereas calm abiding itself will only temporarily suppress. But when it's temporarily suppressed, the mind is quite blissful. The mind is quite light. The mind is quite absorbed. And, so that's just getting at this idea that even if you can temporarily suppress the afflicted states, you will experience contentment. It may not be as lasting of a contentment or as permanent of a contentment, but that's still getting at the same idea that these are opposites, that hatred and jealousy and ill will and maliciousness and envy and all of these are the obstacles to contentment. These are the obstacles that are preventing us from being truly, permanently, really content. So in that sense, a deep abiding contentment is a side effect, as I said, of all of the work that we would do to reduce and ultimately eliminate the afflictions, the delusions, the afflictions, the disturbing emotions, disturbing attitudes, kleshas, all of these different words that are getting at the same concept. More colloquially speaking, I do think there can be a misconception or and maybe it was just when I was thinking about this, and it could just be one way of my own thinking, may not be maybe subtle or not as common, but I think sometimes when we think about contentment, it's almost like a settling, that's one way of thinking about it that I think is a mistaken way of thinking about it. Like to be happy with even if a person feels deprived, or even if a person feels like to just be content with that, right? Oh, I don't have a lot of money, but be content with not having a lot of money. I don't have, whatever, I don't have a relationship, I don't have, but oh, it's okay. You have to just be content with that, And that duality, I think, is not really what's meant, by the real practice of contentment. This idea, when we're coming at it from a scarcity perspective, and we're just trying to convince ourselves that that is what contentment is. I think fullness is really a better way of thinking about contentment, rather than thinking about it from like the perspective of settling for not having everything that one could want, thinking about, well, I do have everything that I could want, thinking about it from the perspective of how full our lives are, and not thinking about it like I just have to be, like almost an admonition, thinking about contentment as an admonition. I think that's a mistaken approach to the training in contentment. Like things aren't how I would like them to be. I'm not where I would want, but I should just be satisfied with that. Because then there's still, we're not addressing the scarcity perspective. We're not addressing the the part of the mind that still would like to have more money, that would still would like to, because which is fighting against this admonition viewpoint that, oh, I should just be happy with what I have. From the Buddhist perspective, we really do have everything that's important. We really do have. So I think approaching the training in contentment from this idea of fullness, from this idea of focusing, and from there's sort of a technical inappropriate attention is kind of the Buddhist way of talking about this. When we focus on, like, we have a choice. When we think, when we're cognizing, we have a choice. Am I going to focus on this aspect or this aspect of whatever it is that I'm thinking about? When I think about what my life is like, I can choose to think about all of the extraordinary coming together, of causes and conditions that have happened, or I can think, what if, what isn't there, what more could there possibly be, thinking about, well, this is my house, but it's not a mansion. This is my car, but it's not a Lamborghini. This is my bank account, but I'm not a millionaire. That kind of inappropriate attention, I think, is where what we have to work with, what we have to, so thinking about what if I did have a better house, if I did have more money, if I did have, would that really make a difference in my ability to train my mind? Would that really make a difference? Would that really lead to, because, those people, are they really more content? Are the millionaires, the whatever, are they genuinely more, are they happier? Are they more at peace? Are they than what I can accomplish, what I can use this life to accomplish? And that's probably generally not true. They have different problems. They might not think about that, they're not worried about the same set of things. They're worried about a different set of things. They have to have security. They have to, worry, they have to worry about what happens when they go out, in their daily life. Are their children going to get kidnapped? Are they going to be extorted? Are they going to, how are they perceived by the public, and their reputation and all of these things? They just have inherited a totally different set of concerns. Yeah, they don't care about the price of groceries or the price of eggs, but they've adopted now just a new set of neuroses and concerns that are plaguing them that we are free from, because they're also not training their mind. They're not necessarily practicing contentment. So when we don't think about the training in contentment as an admonition from a scarcity mindset, but we think, I actually have everything that I need to make real spiritual progress. I actually, having $1 million, having a new car, having a better house, none of that would be useful for me in terms of what are the inner qualities? Because again, from this Buddhist perspective, genuine contentment really has nothing to do with, it's just trading one set of problems for a different set of problems. Real contentment is the degree to which our mind is free from hatred and aversion and attachment and jealousy and envy and maliciousness and so on. And there's nothing, like the Buddha says, looking outside of ourselves is not going to be the solution, to getting to that point, getting to the point where there is, Lama Zopa calls it the thought of no need. When genuine contentment is not this settling, it is the thought of no need. It is the thought that if I had $1 million, if I had, what would I do with that? I only have one mouth. I only can eat so much food. I have a safe place to live. What would I do with these silly things that, that other people are chasing, that other people are putting at the center of their lives. Now, of course, there are not everyone has safety and enough food, and of course that's true. And if the person doesn't have kind of the basics covered, then of course they need to strive, or they need to find resources and so on, in order to try to get to a point of basic safety and basic security and basic, But once that's accomplished, then that person does really have everything that is important for being able to train the mind. And luckily, we're not struggling with, real civil war or real food insecurity. We're eating every day and, and so on. So those genuine extreme obstacles are not part of our experience, and we should, and then of course that could change, but right now we're not facing those genuine threats to our existence. So reorienting ourselves, away from possessions, achievements, reputation, status, and so on, and not being on that sort of hedonistic treadmill, is, I think, the goal of this training in contempt.
Okay, so just to briefly recap, when we're talking about this colloquial versus more Buddhist distinction, still, in either case, we've been talking about, with all of these topics, that there's a constructive and a destructive aspect, or a positive and a negative aspect. With patience, the destructive aspect was anger. With humility, the destructive aspect was deluded pride. So, and we've said how with contentment, the destructive aspect, or the opposite, is agitation, right? And so there's a colloquial aspect to that, where the agitation comes from a comparative mind, right? A mind where the mind of Lama Zopa Rinpoche would call it the mind of constant dissatisfaction, the mind of never feeling like one has enough, or one is enough, or one possesses enough, always wanting more, never being satisfied. That is the colloquial way of understanding this idea of agitation, this comparative mind where we never feel, again, we never have that sense, as I said, that sense of fullness. So cultivating that sense of fullness, I think, is the colloquial way of thinking about this. And then we said, of course, that there's a deeper level to this as well, which is, as long as we are subject to all of those afflicted states, that's another aspect of agitation, right? It's not necessarily thinking about our bank accounts or our possessions, but it's just being under the influence of these destructive states of mind. Necessarily, we will be agitated, but that's the nature of disturbing emotions, is that they agitate. They are painful to oneself. They motivate actions that harm others. No one yells at someone when they are absorbed in loving kindness, compassion, generosity, but we do harm others when the mind is under the influence of hatred, jealousy, envy, maliciousness, ill will, all of those afflicted states of mind. So that's the nature of afflicted states of mind. They're painful for oneself, and they motivate actions that harm those around us. And so our contentment, in a deeper way, of course, will always be blocked as to whatever degree we are experiencing. And that, of course, goes into the Buddhist idea that we can completely transcend all afflicted states, which is not something that you find in a secular context, but you do find that in the Buddhist context, the power of the mind is such that we can transcend even the slightest, malicious intent, the slightest envy, the slightest jealousy, and so on. So those are the two, just to recap, the two ways of understanding this that we've presented. Okay, so now we're going to do a meditation. I'll just briefly try to settle the body, to have an upright spine, stable, comfortable position. Relaxing the body. Moving the mind inward. Take a couple of minutes to concentrate your awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensation that accompanies the in-breath and the out-breath in the space around the opening of the nostrils, breathing naturally and normally, attending to whatever sensation arises, giving yourself the instruction to notice quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation arises in the mind. And then without judgment or frustration, to lift your awareness up from those distractions into places gently but firmly, again and again on the breath. And try to begin to connect with this feeling, this subjective feeling of the fullness of your life. Accepting yourself as you are, being at peace with the present moment. You can picture yourself in a wide open space. And think of the content of your life. Your friends, your family, your possessions, your home. And try to generate a sense of gratitude for all that your life contains. And generate the understanding that nothing is lacking. Feeling deep gratitude. And also think of your interest in spirituality. Whatever degree of experience you have with meditation, prayer, and notice that you have some experience with this deeper sense of fullness as well. Moments when the mind is more calm. When there's a stillness in the mind. Recognize that you yourself can cultivate, deepen that experience, regardless of circumstance. how extraordinary it is that you have all of the necessary inner and outer conditions. Nothing absent. To reach a state of genuine contentment. To allow an understanding of this potential of the mind to permeate the body and mind. Thinking of this inner resource, something that's always with you. This place of deep stillness. Just rest. Within that state, without distraction. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. So again, I think gratitude, again, I think it depends on to what level of what, because again, it's a continuum. So what level of gratitude, what level of contentment, we're going to, as I said, as long as we are subject to any of the afflictive states, our contentment is going to be robbed from us from time to time. We're not always angry, we're not always jealous, but the causes and the conditions arise from time to time for jealousy and anger and so on to be in our experience, and then the mind is necessarily not content. The mind is necessarily agitated. So to that extent, of course, that depends on, from the Buddhist perspective, we don't have to go in there's very profound ways of thinking about that whole topic. Of course, there's the idea that each of those afflictive states have their own opposing training. And then there's the idea that all of the afflictive states are empowered by a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of self, the nature of other. And by overcoming that fundamental misunderstanding, all of the afflictions are simultaneously eliminated, which is the good news from the Buddhist perspective. Like, it would be really exhausting if we had to train in patience and generosity and loving kindness and compassion, in order to eliminate each and every single afflicted state one by one by one. We have those trainings, we have those, and they're important to understand, they're important to bring to mind as we're simultaneously training in wisdom that overcomes ignorance, because you do both, right? If you don't put all of your energy only into understanding wisdom under overcoming ignorance and not thinking about, well, what do I do in a more practical sense when jealousy is arising or when hatred is arising or a situation, because I said we're not always angry, we're not always jealous, but causes will come together, and then jealousy, because of past habituation to jealousy, covetousness, what have you, it just pops into the mind almost without control for us as ordinary sentient beings. It's just there in a really intense way. So we do need these specific antidotes, and simultaneously, and this is not a really, really detailed Buddhist philosophical course, but there is that there is that idea that we aren't actually stuck with having to completely eliminate my anger and then move on to my jealousy and then move on to my greed and my envy, and have to one by that would just be a miserable, That's not true. We can train in wisdom, realizing the nature of self, the nature of other, and then no afflicted state. Once that wisdom arises, no afflicted state can, because they all depend upon ignorance that doesn't understand the nature of self and the nature of other. They require that for their existence, because they're all exaggerated, mistaken states of mind. There are these two tracks. It depends on how much contentment we're content with, right? Or do we see that I will be subject, that as long as I'm an ordinary sentient being who's not overcome the afflicted states, that I can't be really, truly, permanently, deeply content. If we can understand it to that deep level, then we'll be motivated to overcome all of the, to do all of this work to uproot the afflictions. And then, on this more conventional level of this comparative view of dissatisfaction, then that really is the training in gratitude, the training in feeling the thought of no need, the thought of the fullness of one's life, not having this comparative envious perspective, this where the greedy mind, where we have to consume more and more and more in order to be happy. Those are both difficult. I don't think, I think all of the topics that will be, any kind of training the mind is challenging. It's it's not a short process, and we probably won't finish it in this life. But yeah, it depends on to what degree, you are looking at addressing. And I think that's really the heart of Buddhist, the distinction between the colloquial understanding of all of these things and the Buddhist understanding of all of these things is that the Buddhist understanding is always going to be subtler, always going to be deeper, always going to be more difficult. And then, do we want to do that? Do we want to, to what degree are we interested? Because if you can settle on a purpose, then you're no longer searching, right? This idea of dissatisfaction is there's something that isn't, that I don't have, that I need to have. So if you can decide that you are, that you have everything, again, this thought of no need, nothing outside of myself, that yes, I may be moving in a direction, but that there's nothing that I don't already possess that will get me to that goal, then you've got a roadmap. You're not confused, you're not trying to bring in all of these other things. You feel like, well, this is all that is necessary. This is what it is. Being, like you said, being a good person, and you still have to do that. That's still an active, everyday kind of a thing. It's not like I'm already a good person, and therefore, because that was sort of the complacency, right? That was part. It's not finished. You're not done, but you have confidence that it's possible, and that you're not looking for some mystical or some unknown quantity that's that you have to figure out in order to it's a inner strength. It's a sense of inner strength, a sense of inner resilience, that I'm actively engaged in this meaningful pursuit, and I trust that I'm able to accomplish that goal, and that is going to give me a sense of fullness, a sense of, by striving in this goal, by having this, because then you're just, I think when you don't have that, and not everybody, but if you're kind of floundering, then of course you're subject to all kinds of different outside pressures, and you don't have, because the Buddhist path, like for example, if a person decides that that's their purpose, then they have clarity, right? They know what to practice, what to discard. There's a clear. So as long as you have, I think, a roadmap, and that roadmap is clear, then you can withstand these outside pressures of, oh no, you have to be a consumer, you have to be, because society, there's pressures in society that want us to be discontent, that want us to consume more, that want us to be stuck, just taking on more debt and buying more things, and I think you're subject to that much more when you don't have a clear inner roadmap, when you don't, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be Buddhism, but whether any kind of internal system of self-development, if that is your North Star, then that is showing you how to ignore those, what society is telling us, and what kind of the messages of the outside consumerist kind of, which thrives on dissatisfaction, which depends upon the mind of never having enough, never being enough.
I read someone describe that as the culture at large wants